On behalf of Aperture, my name is Christina Caputo, and I'm honored to present tonight's panel discussion, Images, Surveillance, and Power, in collaboration with the photography program at the School of Art, Media, and Technology at Parsons, the New School for Design, and the Vera List Center for Art and Politics as part of our ongoing series, Confounding Expectations, Photography in Context. Just so you know, these programs are generously supported by the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the Henry Nias Foundation, the ASMP Fund, and the Milton and Sally Avery Arts Foundation. Aperture is a world-renowned publisher and exhibition space located here in Chelsea, in New York. We're dedicated to promoting fine art photography in all its forms. We are a nonprofit foundation, and our programs include artist lectures and panel discussions like these, limited edition photographs, and traveling exhibitions. In the back this evening, when you're walking out, please do sign up for our newsletter, and you can also find copies of Trevor's new book, as well as two of Jill Maggot's books, and they'll be available here to sign those as well. Many thanks to all of the panelists for their dedication to education and engagement in the photographic community, as well as the New School, especially Arthur O., George Pitts, Pam Tillis, and Annie Shaw. Tonight, Karen Cooney from the Vera List Center will be introducing this evening's panelists. Thank you.
Good evening. I just want to thank or add my thanks to my colleagues here at the New School and, of course, at the Aperture Foundation, and in particular to Christina. At the New School, again, Pam Tillis and Annie Shaw and Arthur O. are long trusted and wonderful colleagues that I've enjoyed working with for many years at this point. As you have heard, tonight's program is entitled Surveillance, Images, and Power, and it's a seemingly ironic pleasure to investigate secrecy and invisibility through the visual medium of photography. As these issues are very much in the news and extend to notions of civil society and warfare, I think we could not ask for a more distinguished group of speakers, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce them now briefly. You have extended bios of them in your programs, so just a few words. First on Jill Maggot, who is a multimedia artist who combines photographs, installations, printed text, performances, and books. Her work has been exhibited at numerous galleries in the city and abroad, and she had recent one-person exhibitions at the Tate Modern and is also included in a current exhibition at the New Museum. She had participated in a residency program at IBEAM and has contributed to an online journal called Where We Are Now. In New York, most recently, I think many of you will remember her one-person show at the Whitney, where she presented an installation called A Reasonable Man in a Box and investigated acceptable methods of so-called enhanced interrogation of high-level Al-Qaeda operatives, including the use of confinement boxes, and I think we'll hear more about this tonight. Trevor Paglen is a social scientist, artist, and writer who has spent the last 8 years exploring secret activities of the US military and intelligence agencies. And he has done so under the guise of experimental geography. Rather than make us see the invisible, I would like to think that he has made us understand the invisible in its invisibility. Paglen received a PhD in geography from the University of California at Berkeley and an MFA from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. His work has recently been exhibited at large international exhibitions such as the Transmediale Festival in Berlin, the Taipei Biennial, and the 2009 Istanbul Biennial. He's represented by Altman Siegel Gallery in San Francisco and Gallery Thomas Zander in Cologne, Germany. Our moderator is Tom Vanderbilt, a writer and editor specializing in design, technology, science, and culture, whose most recent and New York Times best-selling book is Traffic, Why We Drive the Way We Do, and What It Says About Us, which was published by Alfred Knopf. Previous books include Survival City, Adventures Among the Ruins of Atomic America, which is published by Princeton Architectural Press, and The Sneaker Book, published by The New Press. He's a contributing writer to numerous publications, including Wired, Slate, The Wall Street Journal, Men's Vogue, Rolling Stone, the New York Times, the Cabinet, and Popular Science. To our regret, Marco Peljan couldn't join us tonight, so we will have possibly a more in-depth conversation amongst fewer people. And I'd like to thank them for joining us, and thank you for being here. So please, maybe if the speakers could just come up now. Or Jill, do you want to be you?
Hi, and thank you for that introduction and for including me in this. So my name is Jill Maggot, and I'm going to show you a selection of some of my works. Should I have this? Okay. I'm going to show you a selection of some of my works, and I was thinking about the idea of the panel and photography. So I don't consider myself a photographer, although I use photography sometimes in my work. So I'm kind of thinking about images and creating images and how we capture images, or how I capture images, specifically in the way I'm presenting the work to you. So I'm starting with a piece that I did in 2004 that's called Evidence Locker. And I'm going to be showing it in stills, not in video tonight. But this piece was commissioned by the Liverpool Biennial. And the idea of the work is I've been working with the police in different cities, before this in Amsterdam, and I was thinking about how we are captured on surveillance systems all the time, which is something now talked about a lot. But at the time, Liverpool had the largest surveillance system in the world. So in the city of Liverpool, there were at that time 242 surveillance cameras in the center of the city alone. And I researched that system, and I found out that the basics of the way that system worked is all 242 cameras filmed 24 hours a day in real time, and that footage went back to the police central computer, and the footage was kept for 31 days, and after 31 days, those images would cascade off the system and disappear forever, unless a citizen wrote a subject access request form, which was the legal document necessary to fill out that said who you are, what you were wearing, the time of day, and the incident that happened. You had to send a photo and how many pounds? 10 pounds to the police, and by law, they had to take your image and save it in an evidence locker. So I started thinking about the idea of this surveillance system as the potential for a diary, a visual diary. So I went to Liverpool for 31 days. And every day I wrote a subject access request form to the police, but I filled it out as a love letter. And I made sure that in that love letter, I always fulfilled the legal requirements of what the police needed to find me on the system. So this was the first letter. Dear observer, make me a diary and keep it safe. Take care it is mine. Hold this photograph of my face. Keep all of our entries in order. Put the letters in your desk file and the images in your evidence locker. You can edit everyone else out. Don't worry about finding me. I will help you. I will tell you what I was wearing, what I was the time of day. If there is anything distinguishing about my look that day, I will make sure you know. Hold on to my diary for at least 7 years, statute of limitations. I am enclosing a check. Use it for whatever expenses you have. Sincerely, Jill Maggot. And I wore red every day. And by the end of my 31 days, I had about 27 CDs full of police imagery. And what surprised me is that the police got really into it, and they started following me all the time. So when I would walk down the street, like every surveillance camera would turn. And then I started to get to know the police more, and they have a secret control room. At that time, I'm sure it's expanded. There were 60 surveillance monitors, and they were kind of like the way you see in movies, you know, where it's this kind of concave wall with all of the monitors and then the cops sitting there. And they said lots of funny things, but one thing they said was that they never watch them because it's too distracting. You can't actually watch all those screens, but they need them because that's how they get more money to get more surveillance equipment. So it's very impressive to bureaucrats. And that's something I've always found in my research, is this kind of absurdity of need of more images without there being anyone to actually look at them or know why we're looking at them. So it became a kind of love story between me and the police. So as I said, I would start hanging out with them in the control room, and I started teaching them what I knew about film theory, and I specifically focused on Godard's film Contempt, Le Mépris, if you speak French, which I don't, and saying to them to film me the way Brigitte Bardot was filmed. And it was a really interesting transformation to see how they would call me up. We had each other on speed dial, and they'd be like, "You're walking too fast." And then they started treating the whole system like, "Oh, you should go over to camera number 42. The light's really beautiful there." And it was really a big transformation. So these pictures are, because it was also another need of mine to get deeper and deeper into all of the systems. And there was this other, besides the camera system, there's the FIU, which is the Forensic Imaging Unit in the police headquarters. And that is where they take the surveillance images, and if someone requests them for like a court trial, they have to blur everyone else. So I was giving them images, and on this other file, they were blurring the images for me. And I guess I should mention that I never told them I was an artist. And I've found I had been finding that the second I told anyone I was an artist, they didn't take me seriously. So I call myself a researcher, which doesn't mean anything, and usually works to my advantage. So this was one of the last videos where a lot of the cops were bikers, and so on the last day of my 31 days, all the cops organized. That I didn't know about this, but one of them came to my door and picked me up on the motorcycle and drove through the whole system and then off into, luckily, a sunset, and they all filmed it. But I would say that the main piece in the show is called Trust, and there was one day that I knew all the cameras were following me, and I got this urge to close my eyes. And at the time, I didn't really know why I did it, but I closed my eyes. This one is from that video. And later on, when I went to the police, they said, "Oh, we were really scared when you did that, because if something had happened to you, we wouldn't have been able to help you. We could have seen it, but we wouldn't have been able to help you." And I said, "That's really interesting. Well, why don't I get a microphone and a speaker that's really small, like for cell phones, and I'll hide it in my hair. And if you ever want to talk to me, you can through this system. And will you please record it if you talk to me for my research?" And so they said yes. And so one time when I closed my eyes, I said, "I have an idea. Will you lead me blind through the city?" And that video is called Trust. And for 18 minutes, the cops lead me through the city and tell me, "Okay, watch out for the old lady," or "There's someone else coming, stop now, walk to your right, walk to your left." And for me, this was the moment within the system where there was no difference between my body and that system, and was really kind of the pinnacle moment for me. So these are some of the images from that, and along with it, I wrote a book called One Cycle of Memory in the City of L, and that is all the letters, the collection of the letters that I wrote to the police that really reads like a novella. And those those books are out of print, but if you go to evidencelocker.net off my website, you can sign up to be a witness, and every day you get a letter and a video clip. So I feel like I'm not doing well on this 15-minute thing, like that took 15 minutes. So this is the install from a video called Control Room, which is two screens that sometimes link up and sometimes don't, and it's clips of the police following me from day to night. And I think as an image, the way the videos change is this first set of videos, a lot of people told me they found quite scary, that you have that Big Brother kind of look of the zooming in and someone being watched in the crowd, whereas the later videos have this much more intimate cinematic feel to them. And I'm very interested how these kinds of technologies that are set up to be really objective and not allow any space for an individual identity or a two-way communication, that can become quite an intimate tool if used in that way. And then I did another piece that I would say includes much more photographs than some of my other works, where in 2007, I moved back to New York after living abroad for 5 years in Amsterdam, and it was post 9/11, and I was really amazed by how much the city had changed. And I started noticing the cops in the subway stations, and how that I felt like they'd become like security cameras, because they would just stand on the platform and not move. And watch. And I found that to be quite a romantic position to be in, this kind of watching through the city at night. And alongside of that, I kept hearing the announcements that said, please be advised you may be subject to a search for security reasons. So I started walking up to police officers in the subway and asking them to search me. And they were all like, okay, you're crazy, go away. And so I went up to one cop and just said, again, will you search me? And he said, why do you want me to search you? And I said, well, I heard the announcement that you might search me, and I'm ready, and I'd like you to do it now. And so he said, well, I can't search you, you're a woman, so, you know, I'm a male cop. Male cops can't search women. And I didn't know that. So I asked him instead if he would be interested in training me. And again, he was like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I'm interested in your job. Do you think you might be open to training me? And he said, you know, I got to go. I work the night shift. I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, well, can I get in contact with you again? And he was like, I don't know why I'm doing this, but he wrote down the phone number for the police station. And I called him 2 nights later, and I was like, hi, I don't know if you remember me. And he's like, yeah, I know who this is. And I said, well, I'm serious. I want you to train me. And he said, okay, don't say anything, but I go out of roll call at 11:30 at night. You know where you saw me last. Just stand by the turnstiles, and when I walk out of headquarters, follow me, but do not say anything. And from that point on, for the next 5 months, this is what we did. And he would call me from headquarters, and he would simply say which subway stop that he was stationed at, because they get stationed at different stops all the time. And I would just stand on duty with him. And his job, the New York City cops since 9/11, I don't know if this is still true, but the guys that stand on the subway platforms, their whole job is to watch for terrorists in the tunnel. It's not to like break up a fight on the platform. It's to watch the tunnels and make sure anyone who wasn't supposed to go in there or out of there did. And the guys in the booths that watch the screens, that's their job too. They're watching the surveillance footage. So there was something of this kind of boringness of just standing there and watching for something that most likely wasn't going to come in the city, and how it operated at night, and how the city changed when you're watching it in this way, that I found really beautiful. And this also became a kind of love story, of course not in the traditional sense, but of me and this cop watching the city together at night, and of course me trying to avoid the people above him that didn't know or I don't think knew that I was doing this. So the way that I recorded this, because this project, unlike Evidence Locker, where there was a whole video surveillance system that was installed to be watching and that my existence was only captured through this system, here was a situation where I wasn't supposed to be photographing. I wasn't supposed to be doing anything. So how do you make images from it? So he let me every once in a while take a quick picture, but he was very careful, and so was I, of never having his identity, this one cop, made present. So I was very careful to never have anything that would give him away. And this is the police shirt that he gave me. This is me learning how to use his gun. And inside this case is the bullet he gave me from his gun. And it is shown here in behind bulletproof glass that protects a body from that particular kind of bullet. So it's the thickness to protect you from that bullet. And on the back wall, you see the images I took from the subway. And then there was the book called Lincoln Ocean Victor Eddy, which I should say means love in New York City police language. So any cop, if you walked up to them and said Lincoln Ocean Victor Eddy, they would know that that was love. How are we doing on time? Okay. So this next project I'm going to talk about is called Article 12, or it's called a lot of things. It's called the Spy Project, Article 12. It's had many names because it's gone through many different stages, and it says 2005 to ongoing, but I think it's time to turn that to 2010 and just it's over, I think. But in 2005, although it didn't begin right then, I was commissioned by the Dutch Secret Service. And that came about because there was, with all the global terrorism, and there were two incidents in Holland, the murders of Theo van Gogh and Pim Fortuyn, that the Secret Service in Holland started growing very fast. And it outgrew the building that they were in. And so they were moving to a new building, and it fell, the new building, because it was a new building, it fell under 1% for art, as we call it in New York. So the Dutch Secret Service had to, by law, commission a new artwork for their building. And the curator who was working on that knew my work, and he called me up and he said, I think you might be interested in this. Of course I was. So I applied for it, and I ended up getting this commission, and I proposed to them that I'd done a lot of research on them, and I knew that they were having a real problem with their public image. There had been a lot of leaks. And I also found that there was a clause in the Dutch Secret Service that said that anyone who works for the service, any agent, they can't keep a file on them about their personal data, which is their religious convictions, their ideas about life, the meaning of life, their sexual history. These kind of things a file could not be kept on them. Like, you couldn't type in homosexual into the database and get back a list of names. So I said to them, people don't trust you. You're this faceless institution, and so all these myths are created about you. But what if you hire me as a consultant for personal data, and I can find the human face of your organization? And after a year of trying to convince them, I got full security clearance. And for the next 3 years, I met secret agents privately in bars and restaurants around Holland and asked them about their personal data. And during this process, this was in my contract with them, during this process, I was not allowed to photograph them. I wasn't allowed to know their real names. I referred to every male spy as Vincent and every female spy as Miranda. So they were Miranda 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to, there were 18 of them. And some of them gave me their names, but I found out later that they were lying and it wasn't their names. And so it was I think what's interesting in relation to this panel, it was a real challenge as a visual artist. How am I going to make something out of something where I'm not allowed to make images? So for 3 years, I kept these notebooks, and you can see that says Vincent 1, and they were cataloged, and there were 3.5 of them. And then I had the difficulty of, okay, how am I going to make work about it? So one of the first things I did is for them, because I had to give them something for the commission, is I started through the process realizing that I was wanting to become like them. So it was this fight against myself of my desire to be becoming more like them. And so each one of these describes them, and I found out that if you're a real spy, when you leave the Secret Service for good, you have to leave your keys and all your original information at the door, and you can never walk back into the building again, which I thought was really poetic. So I sacrificed to them all of my original notebooks, and that was the piece that I gave them. And then what I presented to the public is, as the 3 years kept going and I was getting deeper and deeper in, some of the agents started telling me I'd become dangerous. And I asked why, and they said, because you could burn us, meaning that you know our personal information, and if you were to release it, you burn our face, which means we can never be operational. So I made a piece in red burning neon, really bright, so it kind of burns your eyes. These piles of each one represents one of the spies, and the words are lifted directly from the notebooks, and they describe each of my agents' faces. And along with it, the maps were these descriptions. So this one said, his head is square, his features closely centered. He is stiff, his body is static, his hands burst forth as if controlled by someone else. He has half eyebrows. They begin thick but end abruptly. His voice is deep and somewhat muffled. And it goes on this kind of description. And so those were on the wall, and the neon was burning. And then at that show, I gave them a rough draft for my book called Becoming Tartan, which was a book about my experience with the Dutch Secret Service and how I started becoming more like a spy. And I gave it to them, and to make a long story short, it ended up in a face-off with me and the director of the Secret Service, where they were going to confiscate all of my materials, and they said that I'd become too dangerous and that I was a national security threat, and if I didn't hand over all of my materials, that I would go to jail, and there were all these fines. And they confiscated 7 of those prints they just showed you, and they're listed here. So the director of the Secret Service sent me a letter. I hereby provide you of these are the things we're confiscating. He speaks like he is choking. He is very tall and looks like Chewbacca. He is a tall, awkward man with a lopsided frame. So you can see they're kind of a ridiculous thing. But the funny thing in terms of images is that they took the prints and they left the neons. And the neons are the same words as the prints. So once it became an image, it was no longer problematic. So after that, 7 of those prints have been replaced with blank sheets. And you can see on the floor there that some of those neons I turned off. So I took their restrictions, and from now on, those people are always turned off permanently. Now, how are we doing on time? A little bit close, right? Okay. So this is up at the new museum now, but it was, just to quickly say, I ended up striking a deal with the Secret Service that they said to me that my book, they redacted it, and that was hard to get the redactions, but I finally did. And then they said that I was allowed to show my book as an object of art in a one-time only exhibition, after which time the book would become the property of the Dutch government, never to be read. And so I had a show at the Tate Modern where I said, okay, if you want the book, come and get it. It's at the Tate Modern under glass. And there it was waiting for them. And on the last day of the exhibition, they came and took the body of the book. And here at the new museum, I've printed the redacted book as a book. So I knew this would happen, but I don't really have time to talk about the Whitney piece. Should I just end it there, maybe, so Trevor can speak? Okay, very briefly. Sorry, Trevor. This piece was in the Whitney this summer, and I think I got really interested in redaction, obviously, from the Spy Project. And I was looking at government redacted material and realizing from the Spy Project that redaction actually was quite beautiful. Visually, it's beautiful. Like the Dutch redact in white, so everything just starts disappearing, which is pretty smart, I think, whereas in America, it's black and like in your face that something's been redacted. I got into the research of torture through various different ways, and then the Bybee memo. And many of you, or almost every one of you, has probably heard of the torture memos, the Bybee memo. But I don't know, I would dare to guess that no one's read it. Some people have said, oh, the Bybee memo, everyone knows it, but I don't think everyone does. And it's a pretty amazing memo because the logic of what is reasonable, because that's all what legal documents are based on, if you can prove something is reasonable or not reasonable, and the way that they, for 6 months, made enhanced interrogation and torture constitutionally legal is pretty amazing. And so I focused on this one paragraph about insects in a confinement box. And basically, the enhanced interrogators dealing with the war in Iraq said that they wanted to put, in one case, a particular al-Qaeda operative in a confinement box, which is a box the same size as a person crouching. Put them in, and they found out that this guy had a fear of insects. So they were going to tell him that they were putting an insect in the box with him. But so that it wouldn't be torture, in the memo it says, okay, so that this won't be considered unconstitutional, these are the things that you have to do. So you could tell him that it's a caterpillar, or you could infer that it's a caterpillar and not a stinging insect. Or you could never mention the insect, but if he says something about it, then you say it's a caterpillar. So I just found it this really like almost fairy tale-like myth of is the caterpillar in the box with him or not. And so I designed the Whitney space to look like a box, and then I made a kind of a shadow play of a scorpion, because I did the research and found out that a stinging insect in that part of the world would be a scorpion. And I filmed the shadow of a scorpion inside a box to fit the exact constraints of the Whitney room, so that you as a visitor were walking in to the shadow of the scorpion. And I liked the idea of shadows because, again, is it there, is it not there, is it in your mind, is it fear, is it a projection, are you inventing that the scorpion's in the box or not? And so when the people walked in, they heard the sound of the scorpion in this shadow, and then it had the quotes from the Bybee memo on it. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I really appreciate it, and it's great to see everybody. I'll try to be as brief as I can, so we can have some more time to talk. I'll just briefly go over a couple of projects. In pretty much all of my work, I'm interested in trying to see that which cannot be seen. Karen put it quite well, I think, in the introduction, where she said that I'm not really interested in showing something so much as I'm interested in showing the impossibility of showing it, in other words. And I deal with a lot of themes of secrecy and militarism and that sort of thing. One project that I've been doing for a long time has been taking photographs of secret military installation in various places. And oftentimes these installations have tremendous buffer zones around them. They're very, very far away. Oftentimes you can't even see them with your unaided eye. And so I've been developing techniques kind of inspired by astrophotography, using very, very high-powered lenses, telescopes, and that sort of thing to try to image places that you cannot see with your unaided eyes. Some of these images, in fact, the vast majority of them are taken at quite extreme distances. This is a photograph, for example, of a secret Air Force base in Nevada near the town of Tonopah, and the photograph here is taken from about 19 miles away using a lens designed for astronomy. what happens in this image and in other images is that you're looking through so much heat and so much haze and so much distance that light itself begins to collapse, vision itself begins to collapse. And so I'm very, very interested in that, both literally and as a metaphor. I'm very interested in what it looks like when you push the physical properties of vision as far as they will go, and then that is also kind of a metaphor for a lot of the subjects that I'm interested in. This is a photograph of a Reaper drone inside a hangar in Nevada. These are biological and chemical weapons proving grounds in Utah, shot from a distance of about 44 miles. And we have this kind of almost complete collapse into a kind of abstraction with these extreme distances. This is a newer image. I've been recently pushing the techniques I use to include things that are kind of outside of the visible spectrum. What we're looking at here is again photograph, and I put the word photograph in quotes because it's of something called the fence, is what they call it in the military. It's a giant electromagnetic border around the United States. Of course, you know that the United States has a border, a territorial border, but there's also a huge electromagnetic or radar border around the United States, which is located at sites in Alaska, Northern California, along the southern border, Cape Cod, and Greenland. And basically what this does is basically turn the Earth into a lighthouse of sorts. They're by far the most powerful electromagnetic waves emanating from the Earth. And to me, it's kind of weird that the United States border is actually some of the strongest signals that the Earth sends out into space. This, I put the words that this is a photograph in quotes again, because in order to see this border, you have to look at it in electromagnetic spectra that are below what we call visible light. This border is made out of the same stuff that light is made out of, but it's at much longer wavelengths. And so this photograph was taken in collaboration with an amateur radio astronomer in Texas. It's one of the most powerful parts of this border is based at Lake Kickapoo, Texas. And the photograph was taken by tuning an antenna to the transmitter of this fence and tuning another one towards the sky. And basically what you're doing is collecting the carrier signal as well as any reflections that are coming back from the sky, whether they're caused by clouds or airplanes or that sort of thing. Then you collect the data and you shift it up into a visible spectrum, and how far you shift it is kind of arbitrary. I chose a kind of reddish spectrum because that's closest to what the radar spectrum would be. So again, we're kind of trying to see the invisible, not so much to document it. I'm not really interested in documentary so much as to document its undocumentability or something like that. And in terms of dealing with this question, I'm very, very interested in moments in history where representational regimes have collapsed. I think that happened after the First World War, where it was a kind of a historical moment where perception was being profoundly reconfigured, and images were losing their meanings, in particular with the rise of Nazism and the kind of very visual culture of Nazism. One of the kind of radical responses to that was to refuse to speak or to refuse to represent in a certain way. So I'm very, very influenced by these histories, people like Rothko or Turner in the mid-19th century, where again you have another historical moment where representational conventions are collapsing, where notions of time and space are collapsing. The 19th century trope of the annihilation of space and time. This is Turner's Rain, Steam, Speed, and Angel Standing in the Sun. Well, one project I've been doing for a number of years now has been to track and photograph classified satellites in orbit around the Earth. In other words, American spy satellites and Japanese, for some reason, are the only ones that are classified. And this is done in loose collaboration with a group of amateur astronomers around the world who, as a kind of hobby, have tried to maintain accurate, what they call orbital elements or observational data of classified spacecraft in the night sky. And so in order to do this project, I've actually had to learn a lot about rocket science, and also got a commission from I-beam, who funded some work to basically take this observational data and build software that would then model orbits for classified spacecraft using this amateur observational data. What that allows me to do is to predict where different spacecraft will be in the sky on any given night, and then had to learn a lot of different kinds of expanded photographic techniques in order to try to photograph them. So typically in these photographs you'll see some kind of skyscape or with stars, and then there'll be interruptions in it, and those interruptions are these secret moons or these things that are in the sky that aren't officially there. This is a photograph moving through the frame of a spacecraft that was called USA 193 that was some kind of next generation imaging satellite that never quite worked, and the Navy actually shot it down in early 2008. You may have remembered this. This is a kind of important image to me. It represents one of the other themes that, in particular, in relation to some of the photography that I do, which I think very much is quite similar to a lot of the ways that Jill works, is what I've been calling, or I haven't really called it anything yet, but I think about it in terms of kind of entangled photography. And what I mean by that is photography as a practice rather than basically trying to have non-Cartesian photography. In other words, is it possible to have a photographic practice wherein this kind of subject-object relation that's typically implied by photography collapses? And I'll kind of explain what I'm trying to do with this image in that sense. First of all, it's very obviously a kind of classical 19th century Western survey photography kind of image, something that Carlton, Watkins, or Muybridge would have taken. So in that sense, you're kind of locating yourself in, or I'm quite literally locating myself in the place of that historical tradition. A lot of times what we forget about a lot of the 19th century Western landscape photographers is that their work was not always intended for art galleries and museums and that sort of thing. A lot of these guys, Timothy O'Sullivan in particular, also Muybridge, Watkins to a lesser extent, were funded by the Department of War at the time, and their photographs were a part of what were called reconnaissance surveys. And the idea was the Department of War funded these photographers to go out to the West, which was this large kind of unexplored territory the U.S. had acquired in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, and to photograph them. And so in a lot of ways, these classical photographers were to the 19th century what reconnaissance satellites are to the late 20th and early 21st century. So what we're seeing here is me locating myself in that tradition, in the sky above, to the left. There's a disruption in that. That's a satellite called USA 186, which is a photographic reconnaissance satellite. So I'm trying to photograph this tradition of photography in the West, and I think very much about how the tradition of survey photography has moved from the West and up into the skies. And so I'm photographing another aspect of that tradition in terms of this optical reconnaissance satellite in the sky, and of course am in turn being photographed by it. So I'm trying to set up this kind of complicated relationship of seeing in the photograph. Again, this kind of refers back to Muybridge and to O'Sullivan, two very famous Western 19th century landscape photographers. And when I think about photography, I don't think about photography as really as a history of photographs, so much as a history of seeing with machines. And I think it's quite an important distinction. When we think about photography as a history of seeing with machines, I think that with Muybridge in particular here, we kind of have an originary moment where what we might call the fine art tradition and the kind of military or sight machine tradition kind of diverged from each other a little bit. Before that, they were the same in a lot of cases, especially in the West. This is, of course, Muybridge's studies of Occident, the horse. Muybridge, with these motion studies, became one of the first people to see faster than the eye could see, and thereby set in motion this history of a kind of militarized sight machine, which was picked up by Edgerton, who developed first the stroboscopic camera and later the Rappatronic camera. And he extended that Muybridge's early efforts to cut up time into faster and faster and smaller amounts. Edgerton ended up getting contracts from the Atomic Energy Commission and started a company called EG&G. And their prime customer was the Atomic Energy Commission. They were under contract to photograph nuclear explosions because their cameras could see so fast. They could capture thousands of frames a second. They could essentially dissect nuclear explosions, and those photographs could then be used to understand something about how nuclear weapons worked. Well, it turned out that the timing mechanisms in those Rappatronic cameras were very, very precise. Of course, they had to be. And they realized that not only could you photograph nuclear explosions with those timing devices, you could actually put them into nuclear weapons, and they would make very, very good nuclear weapons triggers. So they formed a defense company, and the equipment they developed to do photography actually became a part of the nuclear weapons that they were photographing. And to me, this is kind of indicative of this blurry line between seeing, infrastructure, politics, and culture. When we look at this alternative history of photography, this history of what we might call the sight machine, it goes up into the sky first with, after the war, in things like the U-2 spy planes, and the film developed for U-2 spy planes. We still, you can see it if you buy Kodak aerial film. There's pictures of U-2 spy planes on the film boxes. This tradition then from spy planes goes into reconnaissance satellites and spy satellites. And what starts happening is that all of these seeing machines begin talking to each other. And this is the situation that we have now, which is many, many different forms of machines all seeing and all talking to each other in something that they call net-centric warfare, this vast array of military seeing machines that are basically trying to control the visual field completely, or as completely as possible. And so I very much am interested in becoming entangled with that kind of military or state forms of machine seeing. This is a photograph that I took from an observatory in the desert in South Africa that I rented. And it's of a collection of spacecraft that are parked over Kenya. And they're in something called a geostationary orbit. They're in an orbit that rotates around the Earth at the same rate that the Earth itself rotates. So they effectively stay in place over one point. These streaks here are stars, and these small dots here are spacecraft. And this spacecraft right here, by the way, this photograph is in the new museum in the same exhibition with Jill. But that spacecraft right there is called Pan. And Pan is a very, very strange spacecraft in that it's an American state satellite, but no part of the state has claimed ownership over it. Typically, classified satellites are either owned by the Air Force, the Navy, or the National Reconnaissance Office. And typically, all of these organizations, they will announce when they have a launch, and they'll announce that the payload is theirs. They'll give it a launch number, but they won't say what it is. So the Air Force will say we're launching a classified satellite, or the NRO will say we're launching a classified satellite. What was different with this PAN spacecraft is that nobody took ownership of it. And this was kind of unprecedented historically, that a classified satellite would go up and no agency would take ownership of it. At this point, I'm making stuff up now. From here on out, this is me just kind of trying to figure out what this is. But if you imagine what state agency might want to put up a satellite and not have their name on it, the first person that comes to mind for me is the CIA, who typically don't want their names on things. This orbit is a communications orbit, and it is a communications satellite. What's a communication satellite is basically a bunch of bandwidth. That's essentially what it is. And so you think about, why would the CIA want to have a bunch of bandwidth over the Middle East? And my first idea was that, okay, well, maybe they want to talk to agents in the field or something like that. That's not a good explanation, though, because it's just extreme overkill in terms of what you would need to actually communicate with people in the field or this or that. But one project that you would need a whole bunch of bandwidth over the Middle East for would be the drone war, right? And this satellite, in fact, would be able to support, I think, between 20 and 40 simultaneous drone missions at a time, which require a lot of bandwidth. So anyway, I don't know if any of that's true, but there is several drone wars going on. There's the military version of it, and then there is the CIA version of it, the one that you hear about from time to time in the news in Waziristan and in the tribal territories, the drones that are assassinating people. That's a CIA program. That's not an Air Force program. So it makes sense, perhaps, that they would want to use this satellite to control it. Oh, by the way, here's the patch for PAN. The patch says Palladium at night, but the word on the street is that PAN actually stands for pick a name. And here in they have this picture of this rocket, and then here in the smoke below it, there's a question mark. I've been doing a lot of work with drones lately, photographing them and making kind of 19th century albumin prints out of them and just kind of trying to understand these things. This is a recent project, which is the way that the way that most of the drones work is that they're flown via communication satellites. So for example, the pilot is typically in Nevada, and the signal goes, the pilot flies it, the signal goes up from the joystick to a communication satellite over the west, gets relayed to another one over the east, and the signal goes down to the drone in the east. So when the pilot moves the stick, the signal goes all the way up, and then the airplane moves. That process takes about a second because it's limited by the speed of light. And the speed of light actually takes some time to work. You used to hear this on international phone calls. Now, a lot of these video feeds are unencrypted, and the reason for that is because much of that infrastructure was built in the mid-1990s, and they didn't bother to put hardware encryption into the infrastructure. So nowadays, when they want to encrypt it, it adds latency because it's a software encryption. And what happens then is now the pilot moves the stick, signal has to get encrypted, go up to the satellite relays, back down, decrypted, the airplane receives the signal, and then it's got to repeat that process. So that adds about 2 or 3 seconds of latency into the entire system. So it makes it much more difficult to fly the airplanes, and they don't do it that often where they want to encrypt it. The video that you just saw right now was developed in collaboration with a satellite hacker, for lack of a better word, where the idea was that you could look up what satellites the military was leasing bandwidth on, and with the right equipment and right software, what you can do basically is point a dish at the correct communication satellites, and then you can go through all the channels on the satellite. Satellites have channels on them like a television does, and you can go through all of them looking for whatever strange things might be on there. So this video is called Drone Vision, and I ended up with hours and hours and hours of this footage of these drones just kind of looking at the world, and I edited them down into a 5-minute video, and I edited out all the targeting imagery, which was the vast majority of it, and I only kept the in-between moments, the moments where the drone seemed lost or was looking at the world around it and was kind of somehow distracted from the mission that it was supposed to be doing. And some of my more recent things that I'm researching now, I'm thinking very much about time. And this kind of, obviously I'm thinking about time a lot in relation to drones and these kinds of image making and what 21st century versions of this annihilation of space and time might look like. But then just as in some of my other work, it's about distance and trying to see as far as you can. Is it possible to see through time in a way that is perhaps analogous? So I've become very, very interested in artifacts that are stranded in time. And on the left, what we have are cliff dwellings from people who left the Southwest around 1100 AD and whose the remnants of their situation are somehow stranded in time. And on the right, we have a photograph of spacecraft that are in perpetual orbit around the Earth. And I got very, very interested in the idea that at some point in the future, there'll be no evidence of humans on the surface of the Earth, but all of our spaceships will be in orbit around the Earth in perpetuity. Coming back to this idea of entangled photography, or trying to ways of doing photography in which the subject-object distinction becomes collapsed, and using that as a political moment perhaps is a very different project than the traditional one of documentary photography, producing representations of whatever, people, crimes, poverty, injustice, or what have you. And I think this is a very good example of the kind of thing that I mean with this entangled photography. This was a TSA poster that came out recently saying, "Don't let our planes get into the wrong hands." Thank you so much.
Sound here?
Hello?
Hello?
No, but
Okay.
I don't think so.
Is there going to be sound? Is that better?
Yeah.
Well, in interest of time, I'd like to get to sort of audience participation as soon as possible, so I'll just have a few comments and cut my questions way down. But I had surveillance very much in my mind last week. I was in Lisbon, and I saw for the first time my very first real-life panopticon at a place called the Miguel Bombarda Hospital. And the panopticon, for the uninitiated, is a radical prison architecture designed first proposed by Jeremy Bentham, English philosopher in the 18th century, in which the idea was you had the prisoners surrounding, in a circular form, a central tower in which the observer was mounted. The observer had sort of blinds in his tower, so the inmates were never quite sure when they were being watched and when they weren't. And this was, as Bentham put it, a new mode of obtaining power of mind over mind in a quantity hitherto without example. And of course, it was Michel Foucault who then made this famous. And just to sort of summarize, I think some people argue that we've moved, from this sort of physical panopticon into electronic panopticon, in which, sort of the there's a world of images we're now dwelling in, and surveillance, and a sort of unseen, continuous world of unseen watching in which we are at the center and in which we're often participating and contributing to that. In fact, we're all being filmed now at this event. We've signed releases to give our images away. You don't have to worry about this, but we're entering increasingly into interesting legal territory. You may have heard, seen the case of Wafal Bilal, the artist in the New York Times recently over at NYU. I'm not sure if he's even in the crowd tonight, but implanted a camera in the back of his head, and this is going to be transmitted to a museum in Qatar. NYU has a bit of a problem with this. They've asked him to put a lens cap on the back of his head when he's in class. So it's sort of, even as NYU has its own battery of images going on. So that's sort of where we stand, just kind of since surveillance is in the theme of the panel tonight. But I really wanted to get more to the actual artwork and your relation to surveillance and images. So, but photography and surveillance, an interesting relation, almost coexisted from the beginning. There's the Tate Modern's Exposed show recently. Interesting bit of wall text there. An American magazine called the American Law Register, 1869, predicts when the art of photography is perfected, the streets and alleys of our great cities will be swept by photographic batteries, so located as to take from many points of view at once the likenesses of persons engaged in disturbing the peace. So it's a very prescient document. We didn't actually get CCTV and the like until 100 years later in Trafalgar Square in the UK in 1960 was the first documented surveillance installation. But so I'm interested in interested not just in the functional connection there, but the kind of issue of relational aesthetics question. Photographers like Paul Strand have famously photographed, or wanted to photograph blind people, thinking that that you can't fake your expression, you get the true unguarded moment, that they can't modify their behavior. And in some ways, I think under this surveillance regime, we're often blind. And I'm just wondering, how you think the presence of how do you think being aware or unaware of the presence of these being under surveillance changes the relation of power, or does it? The surveillance camera players, who you may be familiar with, have a poster that says "We know you're watching" as they sort of act out these scripts in front of the surveillance cameras. But does that matter? Anyone want to take a stab at that incredibly long-winded?
I think you've worked much more with that kind of infrastructure than I have. So.
Well, I think. Also, just looking at what Trevor showed, most of these systems are built to watch for a specific thing. So the drones and the satellites, whether we know always, you have more information on this, of what they're looking for a specific target. And I think that my sense has been more, and of course I haven't generally, besides with the Dutch, been a target. I think it's more interesting of this expectation of being watched, or when people are talking so much about privacy, my image is being captured, and I think that most of the time, even if it is no one, it seems to me that no one is watching, and so it's even more lonely that there's all the. I just usually think of it in emotional kinds of terms of what's being recorded, who's watching it, is your information important? Like I saw just recently a trailer for a film that was coming out, and I don't remember the name, but this guy said for a month. Have you seen it? Okay, this guy says for a month that he's going to try to disappear completely, but he's going to put these investigators after him and see if he can disappear from his life. And the thing is, and it's so amazing because they can keep finding him through the surveillance systems. And I don't think that's amazing at all. I think that those systems are all set up, and seems pretty obvious you could find someone, but like the fact that he had to set up this entire infrastructure of investigators to find him seems almost like this narcissistic desire that it's understandable of like, are you watching me? Okay, then can I get you to watch me? And who am I as a regular civilian? So I think it's really psychologically complicated in terms of perception and fear and desire. I can't separate it from that question of like, are we being watched?
It's interesting, philosophical one. If the image is being watched by someone, does that make it surveillance when that happens? Just
Right.
the mere act of recording. And now, and Trevor, you hinted at this just a bit, we're now getting into the realm of things like algorithms that can actually interrogate the images to look for, oh, this package has been left for 15 minutes unattended, or look for people of wearing a certain shirt color. So where the machines are going to start to ask questions of the images. And Jill, you made the comment once, I thought was interesting, you sort of wondered whether the cameras themselves as sort of public architecture were more similar to gargoyles of the old building, kind of a symbolic. Do you still sort of tilt more in that?
I think, again, it depends on the situation, and I think it's really dangerous to generalize, but I do think that there's an element of at least in the work I've done, where the idea of a technology that is visible. I mean, with the surveillance cameras, they have this interesting position of being beige, so you can't see them. But yet, like, if you're going to do something bad, you might notice them. This kind of thing. So, I do think that question of gargoyle is still relevant, but even with like the idea of the Whitney piece that I did, again, it's also like, is there something in the box with you or not? You know, and that the possibility of something being in there is more powerful. I mean, I think that sometimes when you're actually faced with what you fear, it's less scary than when the potential of what's scary is out there. So I think it is a psychological kind of warfare to, if you do think you're being watched, in a kind of loneliness if you think they're there and they couldn't care less about you. So kind of both.
Trevor, does that?
Yeah, I
ring
mean,
any bells?
that's what panopticism's all about, right? I mean, panopticism is about the idea that it doesn't matter whether there's someone in the guard tower, because you act as if there was. Or the idea of panopticism is not that somebody's watching you; it's that you're watching yourself because somebody else might be watching you, right? And so, in all these different kinds of ways, and I think that that's a part of it, and I think that there is that relationship. I mean, these are complicated, like, kind of relational forms of seeing in that, which I'm really, really interested in, because it's not. There's a theory of vision in there, perhaps, that's very different than a theory of representation, which I'm interested in. And I guess beyond that, what I'm also interested in was, how do machines see for machines? In other words, like, to what extent does, okay, the guard's gone, and now just the machine of the panopticon sees and interprets on its own, or something like that. I don't quite have the language for it, but it's something I'm just trying to work through in my own work at the moment, and trying to think about that in terms of relationality and in terms of geography, really. And so I'm thinking a lot about geographies of photography, I guess, in that sense.
I mean, and shifting gears, I mean, thinking of the images you just showed, the long-range work, I mean, when I saw these in the book, it sort of reminded me of some of the photo paintings of Gerhard Richter, and where he's sort of, I guess, playing with the fidelity of photography as a medium. Your photographs, I guess, because they're pushing the bounds of what's actually physically possible, and because there's so little known objectively about what you're photographing, I find myself looking at that, I'm mentally struggling to sort of fill in the blanks and bring myself into the image. And I wonder if the viewer can almost be tempted to read more into those than is actually there. I mean, you have this photograph of the National Reconnaissance Office. There's a woman at a computer late at night, and she may be playing Sudoku or updating her Facebook page, but to my mind, the most evil things are sort of, the most sinister covert activities are going on. And
No, absolutely. I mean, there is, when you're looking at these things that you can't see or you can't represent, I mean, there is an element of desire that's wound up within, right? I mean, there is these kind of blank zones or whatever become almost kind of an inverted mirror of ourselves. They're things that onto which we can project the inversions of our fantasies. In other words, and this is why a lot of conspiracy theories, things emerge around places like Area 51 or this or that, the next thing, or the FEMA trailers or something like that, because those spaces don't speak back in a way, right? And I think that this is something that is everywhere in your work as well. I mean, you really foreground that aspect of seduction here. But for me, that's very much a part of this, of what I'm trying to do, I guess. You know? And that moment of abstraction, that moment of unknowing, is really, really important to me, because I wonder to which we are just kind of culturally, we just don't trust images, and we know that they don't tell the truth. And you know, what does it mean to be a photographer or to produce images when you can Google any image that's ever been created of anything, you know, in 2 seconds? So how do you respond to that? How do you work with images in the face of that being where we're at kind of culturally?
And I wonder, you know, because you both sort of interject in some ways with, I guess, you know, the regime of power. I mean, Trevor, when I was at the Nevada test site, an area you've photographed many times, I was there in an official capacity with a guide. So there was an interesting kind of rigidity there where there was the Sedan crater, former test crater of a nuclear blast. I said, can I take a picture of the crater? And they said, sure, you just can't photograph the sky behind the crater. And I was, you know, thinking, well, that's sort of photographic air rights or something. That's kind of interesting. And but I'm wondering, you know, in doing your work, have you actually crossed legal boundaries? Is it illegal to take these long-range photographs? It sort of reminds me of the WikiLeaks stuff. It's illegal to hand the stuff off, but it's illegal to possess it. And then, Jill, you've in some ways worked more within the system up to a point where you sort of broke with the Dutch Secret Service. And my question for you is more just how they responded to your initial, how do you get to work within the system? Was it difficult? And then how it turned out?
You go first.
Well, in those series of images, I basically did a lot of research trying to figure that out, and it's an unresolved question. The basis for this no photography stuff in relation to military things is the Internal Security Act of 1950. And and it's ambiguous in the language of it whether or not there's military bases where they say you can't take photographs of them, but it's unclear in terms of what the statutory basis for that is whether that only applies to if you're on military property or off. And when you look at the case history, you find that nobody has been prosecuted for photographing a military base if they were not on the military base when they did it, right? And so it's a matter of, with a lot of projects, that you kind of look at the case history and then you kind of infer what is probably okay and what's probably not. What's interesting about the WikiLeaks case is, and we all know that the law is not something like here's this line and you cross it or you don't. I mean, the law is somebody wants to mess up your life, they'll figure out how to use the law to do it, and then you try to use the law to defend yourself from it to whatever extent you can. But it's really very amorphous what's legal and what's illegal. If you know, I mean, obviously murder's illegal, but when you get into this territory, it's very much about people using the law to further their own political objectives, really. And what's interesting about the WikiLeaks thing is that, you know, we've got like Joe Lieberman talking about using the Espionage Act of 1917 to try to go after Julian Assange, which there's no precedent for that in the case history of the Espionage Act, that it's been used against someone who was not a member of the military or working for the executive branch in some fashion. I mean, and that's a perfect example of basically these guys want his head and are trying to figure out how to use the law to do it. And
Well, they're using the sex offense as a way.
Well, that, you know, that I just bracket that out when I'm talking about the WikiLeaks.
But it is interesting of like, okay, well, I'll use something else.
Yeah, so Jill, so you were essentially allowed inside the Panopticon, and how did you do that, and what was the interest in the organizations you were working with in allowing that, and then how did it go wrong?
I can't answer for them, obviously, but I think it's been different in each case. But with the Dutch I think it's the best example because it was the first time I had to kind of battle myself for a while because I was obviously taken into the system. They commissioned me. And in that case, being an artist was helpful because, it was the first time I flat out had to say I'm an artist and I'm getting this commission to do something. And I was so worried. It took me a while to understand who I was then, if they had an idea of who I was already. But what was interesting in that case, and I think it's really indicative of how art is seen right now compared to other times, was because I was an artist, they didn't care. Mm-hmm. And I just kept getting more and more information, and no one seemed to notice. And people were telling me things they weren't supposed to be telling me. And then it wasn't until the rough draft of the book got to the bureaucrats that they were like, whoa, wait a second. So being an artist kind of made me covert, because they just thought, oh, she's just going to make a nice portrait. So it was their interpretation of what an artist was, and why I came up against that wall of, I had always been working within the system, and when the system either imploded or exploded, that's when it ended. And then here I was in a system where suddenly, I thought I did my job, and then they came back and said, no, we want it all back. And that wasn't the rules. So I had an American lawyer, and he was like, you can totally win this. He said, first thing I need from you is your contract with them. And I was like, I don't have a contract. And he was like, you don't have an agreement of what's secret and what's not secret, and you had security clearance. And I was like, I don't have a contract. And he's like, okay, you can win. And so it took, I kept writing the book, and it was this obsessive thing of finishing the book. And it wasn't until I finished the book that it sounds so dramatic, but it really was. I kind of woke up and I was like, I'm writing in a black hole. I've maintained that I stay within the system, and either I go rogue or I don't. And in the end, it was very hard, but I decided not to go rogue because I realized that they made themselves visible by trying to make me invisible, and that the white gaps of the redaction added something that I could never have added on my own. But it was really hard to give up words. It was a very bittersweet thing, and I'm still frustrated about it. And it did make me question, am I always going to stay in the system, or am I going to engage the system in the same way? I don't know. It definitely leads to a kind of crisis of process, I think. So that's, I guess, how I would answer that.
Well, just being cognizant of the time, I really want to, sort of open this up to the audience. And there are 2 microphones at either side. People can either queue up or pass them around, whatever you're more comfortable with. And
I think I'll pass the microphone around.
okay.
Yeah. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand.
I'm scared.
Yeah.
I have a question for Trevor. My question is whether you have considered broader context for the issues of visibility and invisibility, because as we know, there is dark matter, for example, or it goes back even with the internet, supposedly there is dark internet which we don't know of, but there are people who are using it. Yeah. So that's the question.
No, absolutely. In a longer presentation, I actually talk about dark matter, and I've never talked about the dark internet, but when I was researching I did a book about the CIA several years ago, and it's a project I didn't show it this evening, but I was actually working with I don't even know what you'd call this guy. I never knew his name, but he was one of these dark internet guys who had basically developed ways to search this internet that's not really available through Google, and we were using it to try to uncover very small details about airplane flights and pilots' licenses and all kinds of really weird things. I'm working on some projects now that, I actually, when I was as an undergraduate, I studied philosophy of religion, and I was very interested in these kinds of questions. These are very, very old questions about what are the limits of the visible and that sort of thing. And some research that I'm doing now, I'm looking at that a lot. I was looking at it some more when I did a project about patches for secret military projects, and I had, in my mind, was relating that to like Hellenistic mystery religions, basically. And I've been looking at that material again a lot recently.
I actually just saw an estimate that as little as, we think of Google as omniscient and omnipresent and omnivorous, but as little as 15% of the actual internet is readily visible by Google's search engines, and whether it's dark or just sort of this. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Someone else really must have a question.
I'm noticing that there's a kind of disparity potentially between the joy of the research, of the uncovering, of the elaborating, of the intrigue of getting in or out with images or with a performance, and let's just say the research component, and then the results, let's call it the aesthetic objects or visible representations that are the echo and trace of those activities. So it seems to me, I'm going to just continue that divisionism between the two. So it seems to me there's a public interest side to the work that takes up what are contentious public issues of privacy and intimacy and the extension of government into the individual lives as they can be recorded and parsed and accumulated. And then on the other side, it seems to me that there's almost a necessary dysfunctionality in the art gesture that allows itself the permission to be irrelevant. And I wonder how...
Irrelevant, you mean in a political sense, in terms of it...
Well, I'm throwing this out in the sense of a kind of provocation in a way to say, obviously surveillance is a provocation upon the individual rights of individuals. It seems to me that artistic responses to that are a provocation in reverse to those organizations, structures, societies that employ surveillance.
Maybe that's an easy way of putting it, though.
Right? But I'm just saying that's one of its appearances. On the other hand, it might be that the strength of the activity of the art making is actually in the uncovering, in the laying bare of the devices of dissembling and of invisible, making things invisible, othering the invisible, and only allowing visibility for certain things and not allowing visibility for others. And so in some ways you are participating in those processes of concealment and revelation, however one wants to look at that. So I'm, in a more pointed way, I'm trying to get some grip on what the relative priorities are in relationship to what we would call the accomplishment of the work. If we don't really know the objective of the work, then it's hard to know when and how we've accomplished it. Absolutely. We might know its practice, we might know what happened, we might be able to tell a story, we might have pictures illustrating a story, but we still might not be able to know, perception and aesthetics aside, whether or not it's produced, in fact, the thing at which it was intended to do so. We have some feeling of intentionality around art practices. And
we, who do you mean we?
I think we, the audiences who come to these lectures, have some purchase in our stake in the discussion around not only how you see your practices, but whether or not they're effective. And how you judge effectiveness in your own work. Is it an aesthetic effect?
Do you want to answer?
You know, those kinds of questions.
I think we can both respond to that.
Yeah, we should definitely both
It's something
respond.
that we both spend an enormous amount of time thinking about.
Well, there's a lot of things you said, so I'm like, a kind of every sentence I was like, this, so I try to remember.
Choice.
I have no desired effect other than first and foremost to myself is like I think this idea of perception, revelation, and uncovering is every work of art. in every process, like when I used to be a painter, it was still that amazement of the image that was coming out as I was making it. So I think the process is always about exploring through making, and for me, the research is part of that process, and I don't know how to disentangle them. So in terms of like what my desired effect is, as I said again, like I kind of go into something and don't really know what my desired effect is, and more come upon that or discover something in the process. So and maybe it's easier for me to also look at Trevor's work, because it's not mine, so I'm not as close to it, but follow it. But when I look at Trevor's work, I don't get this feeling of, oh, now I've like uncovered the technologies of the CIA or things going on, but I do see the sky differently, and see a lot of different things differently, and think about of those very questions of the legalities of, if you take a photograph inside a boundary, might be illegal, but if you have a bigger technology, it becomes legal. So that's like one element, but then you have these beautiful images that kind of look like a Rothko, which I've always thought, and then he showed that, so meaning gets compounded again about visibility and invisibility. So there's so many things happening that I think to ask for one desired goal or effect, I think you'd be closing off so many other aspects of the work, and that's like the most beautiful thing. I think what happens in art is you have something, and it's this and this and this and this and this, and it explodes into meaning. So I don't know, am I rambling?
No, I think the way that I think about it is very similar to the way that you think about it in terms of, I'm going to preface this by saying that I've written a number of books about these topics that if you read them, you would have no idea that I was an artist. And I like to write books because you can make a linear argument and you can support it, and you can make a set of claims and a set of explanations about something that sometimes artists try to do that, and it's just horrible, really, you know? And I'm not saying that every artist that does that is horrible, but it's very, very hard to do that with art, and I can't work that way. And even within that, there are different kinds of means, ends, relationships, right? I did a book called Torture Taxi about the CIA's rendition program, and the point of that book was to help shut down that program, to help make it visible. This was collaborating with human rights researchers and lawyers and things like that who were working on these sets of cases. Now, I'm not sure, in terms of thinking what art can do, I think what I want out of art is stuff that helps us see who we are now, right? Art that helps us generate a cultural vocabulary that can be some part, that can contribute to the way that we just even understand society. And before we can even talk about, let's decide whether this radar fence around the United States is a good or bad thing, or these kinds of things, we need a vocabulary to even begin having that conversation. And a cultural vocabulary is not just words, it's images and sounds and videos and things like that. So I think that art can really play, has to be a part actually of the developing a cultural vocabulary. So I guess that's just in general what I mean. But I think if you put the burden of having some kind of causal relationship between art and political policy or something like that, then every single work of art throughout history is going to let you down,
Jeremy Bentham wrote a pamphlet called The Panopticon or New South Wales, and the British government didn't build panopticons, it opted for transportation, which has always made me wonder if Foucault just gave us a bum steer in intellectual history, that it's actually not about that Heideggerian bringing close, it's about pushing things away. And the Liverpool surveillance system and the satellite and drone system seems to be much more about pushing trouble away and keeping it at a distance. And I wonder if you start to think about this work differently if you think about that, not about as this intrusive, invasive thing, but quite the opposite of a non-engagement and non-involvement. And looking at both your work, I get a very strong sense of that. And I wonder if that resonates with how you've thought through the practice.
I mean, for me, like, I actually don't buy this. I mean, I don't think about the things that I look at in terms of panopticism at all. I mean, the point of panopticism is that the apparatus is visible. And the panopticon, like, as a structure, as a metaphor, is not really a structure of domination. Like, it's a biopolitical structure, which is very different than a structure of domination. Like, and the things that I look at more are something that you might associate with, like, a command economy or an economy of violence, wherein you don't want the whole apparatus to be visible, right? And so I guess I think about the surveillance systems and things that I look at really not in terms of panopticism at all. I think a lot of people have been very confused by over-applying Foucault.
I agree with you. I think that's what I was sort of trying to say, when everyone's talking about, oh, don't you feel invaded, don't you feel intruded, and I've always felt them kind of lonely and erasing of the individual, of course, unless you are the target that it's watching. And so for me, a lot of my work has been exploring, trying to have a personal relationship with something that I can't understand or that doesn't include me, and what does it mean to be included somehow? And I think that desire of pulling something that's far away or that I can't understand close to me, for me, it's come up like in many projects as a kind of intimacy or seduction, but that might change over time too, because you as a person change. And but I do think that these kinds of grappling with whether through whatever instruments or process you choose is this way of bringing something really foreign down so that you can look at it to just try to understand it and yourself in relation to that thing. And so maybe going back to the question of what is art doing, I would say a huge part of my process is simply taking something that I don't understand, that I find intriguing, that doesn't include me. I mean, maybe just kind of because I walk through certain systems by existing, but it doesn't really include me. So how do I engage with that world? And these are some of my attempts. And the beauty of not knowing what the answers are going to be.
Which reminds me, Jill, you had a comment. I think it was the secret itself is much more beautiful than its revelation. And Trevor, thinking of your work, think of a line from Diane Arbus who says something like, "I love what you can't see in a photograph." Mm-hmm. And I wonder what sense of, for me, some of the aesthetic power comes from that distance. Mm-hmm. And if tomorrow you were invited into Area 51 with, and take whatever pictures you want, I mean, do you think we would? How would that?
It'd be totally boring. Yeah. It'd be like a bunch of people doing data entry. Really?
Yeah.
I talk to these guys all the time. I talk to a guy who said the Area 51 is the most boring job I ever had in my life.
Yeah. So many of the spy people said that too. They're like, it's a desk job.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's not the point. I mean, the point is that. Yeah. I mean, what we're doing is what artists have always tried to do is like, how do you represent the limits of the sensible, right? How do you come to terms with like the limits of your own perception or your own limits to understand the world or make sense of it?
And I also think, just to add to that, when we talk about art, which I think is sometimes another word for aesthetic value, sometimes how it's used, and that's something that I think about, I would say, daily. You know, of what is the image that comes out, and trying constantly to fight myself of of what is an acceptable image and what is an acceptable product, and is it sometimes better to leave it blank and to frame the blankness and to know that like it's not always going to be beautiful or luscious or these kinds of things, and that's okay. And I think that, you know, always looking at art and stuff, that's something you have to keep talking yourself through and looking at and rethinking, and it's very challenging, but I think really interesting to kind of deconstruct your idea of what is the image that comes out, and what is an image,
Right.
and can a word be an image? Like anyway, it just keeps going.
Absolutely.
I think it was the writer Jeff Nicholson had a comment that was interesting. He said, you know, a few decades ago, if you saw someone walking down the street with a camera, a guy with a camera, you'd sort of, your eyes would perk up. You'd sort of look, what's he taking a picture of? You know, who is this? Is he a voyeur? What is he doing? But now, I mean, there's such a huge onrush of images. I mean, with every sort of technology. I wonder, you know, how we've changed as subjects. Have we all become voyeurs with this proliferation of images? And I mean, back in the 1980s, Mark Crispin Miller had an essay called "Big Brother is Us Watching," and he was talking only about television, the way we sort of reacted to television, acted as if we were already on television. This was pre-internet, pre-Twitter, pre-radical transparency.
Reality TV.
Reality TV. I read an interesting story the other day. Some people were, a ring of thieves were operating on based on people's Facebook updates. When people were bragging about their vacations in the Bahamas, those thieves would go to those people's houses and rob their houses. So, sort of, you know, we've all become sort of exhibitionists. Is that, you know, sort of a radical response to the surveillance regime, or do you think that's actually happened? And have you come across that? This might be more within your work. I don't know. But
I haven't thought much about it, because also it's funny. Maybe I think Trevor and I have even talked about this. Like, I don't consider myself a surveillance artist. You know? Like, I'm just like
it was in the title of the
I know. No, but seriously, like the first time I used a surveillance camera was because I made this mask for kissing, and I wanted to get inside the mask. And I was at MIT at grad school, and so someone was like, well, you could use these spy cameras for that. And I'd never heard of these lipstick cameras, and I totally became a fetishist on how they looked and then how the image looked. And it was always, for me, like, I've always loved the imagery. And then, of course, through the process of research, you can't help separating them from who's looking through them. And so it was never like, I'm interested in Big Brother or I'm interested in power, and so I'm going to focus on this. It just kind of naturally evolved. So why did I say that? What was the question? But it was, anyway, but this idea of like, you asked about how do we think about Facebook and now and all these things, and that's just what I mean is like I think what I really responded to with Trevor's is this idea of romanticism that you brought in so much, and I'm feeling that more too, that it's not as much about following what's happening with Facebook and Twitter and what does that mean, but there's something in the way of looking and what it means when you look into the heavens, or these questions, these spiritual questions that come out, and also like that there's so many other things happening that it doesn't always like naturally just flow into, okay, what's the next technology and what's the next power.
Jill, in your work, one of the things I'm really interested in is where is that line between your life and your work? Like, is that something that you construct? Like, here's the line, this is the part of me that's public, here's the part of me that's private, because some of your work is so intimate, you know? But I don't look at you on Facebook or anything like that. I don't know. You're like, here's what I'm doing.
I hate Facebook anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering, like, because I'm often shocked at the kinds of information that people are willing to put out in public, like, and even like with me, like, I hate it when people like post on my Facebook wall and they're like, "Oh, good seeing you last night." It's like, I don't want the world to know where I was last night. But what's your relationship to that? But because it seems really relevant.
Right, but there's somehow different, because like I'm the same as you. I hate Facebook. You know, someone posted when my cat died, I'm sorry, your cat died. I'm like, really? That's something people are writing on Facebook? You know, it's just these kind of lines. But although I share a lot in the work, you know. It's more like when I'm engaged in the process, I try not to censor myself in that way, because what I'm experiencing and what I'm feeling is so integrated in what's happening in that particular system that I tried it once with the Dutch Secret Service. Some critic had written something obnoxious about evidence locker and said that I was narcissistic, and I was like, oh yeah, well, in this next project I'm just not going to include myself. And so some of the notebooks, I just started asking questions, and I didn't write my feelings about the agent. And I started reading it, I was like, this is journalism. Right. Like, I'm not interested in reading it. And then in the parts where I had written, I'm feeling like this, and he's looking at me in this weird way. And then, like, I'd read my own writing, and I became re-engaged. Mm-hmm. And so I think that kind of following myself and writing from observation, and that kind of observation, the only way I observe is kind of processing it through myself. Like, I just have to do it. And I know that some of it might in the end make me look bad or give out too much or whatever it is, but like, it's part of it. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that, like, if I'm home with my son and we're, you know, something beautiful or intimate happens, like, I'm not going to incorporate that into the work unless it's part somehow. It was like I was involved in something and it made sense to be part of, but it's not a desire to be public in that way. And I think maybe I use art in quotation marks to allow that to happen, and I realize it's part of it. But I don't invite it on other levels, and I'm actually quite private, I think, for the most part. But there's no clear line in depending on the situation, though.
Right. In other words, so you're not assuming a character. That's not the way you think about it.
No. I think in some way I assume a character in the same way we all do, that if you walk into a business meeting or you're teaching, that you have on a different hat, but you're still you. I think that, like with the Secret Service piece, I had my own cards up, you know, or sometimes I let them down, but it's about like what you let out and what you don't let out, but I'm not a different character. I'm definitely still me.
Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Yeah. My question was about sort of the role of violence and surveillance, and specifically the emergence of new technologies related to surveillance. So particularly we see how the UAV becomes the unmanned combat aerial vehicle, and similarly we also have the birth of remote gun turrets that come from, you know, surveillance technology. And so I was wondering what both of your views were on the role of violence in surveillance and how military technology has progressed.
You go.
I don't have anything profound to say about that. I mean, I guess honestly, I have a problem with the word surveillance anyway. I think it's just one of these words that to me doesn't mean anything, because like you're talking about a UAV doing surveillance. Okay, well, let's be like a lot more specific about what that is. Are you talking about a UAV along the border with the United States and Mexico, which is an unarmed UAV, which is talking to Border Patrol guys? Are you talking about one that's doing strikes in, you know, Waziristan, these unmanned combat aerial vehicles? I mean, there's, I don't know. I mean, I just don't, I'm just kind of very, I don't mean this in a bad way, but I feel like it's kind of like one of these questions where like, here's an abstract thing here, here's an abstract thing here, let's put them together and come up with a third abstract thing, and I just don't have anything intelligible to say about that, I guess, you know.
I guess just in general, I would say I agree with Trevor, but I would say from what I know of the drones, for instance, let's just be very specific of what you said about there's a guy in Nevada, and if I just take that instance, I do absolutely think that the more you remove yourself from, I mean, this has been proved, you can go back to, why am I blanking on his name, the guy who did the Harvard tests, very famous, case, yes, thank you. That, you know, people, if you can hit a button and people blow up and you then go out and get drinks with your friends right after and you're across the other side of the planet, like, I think it's natural that violence would go up if you're not in the face of it. Like, I don't know how that relates to surveillance or anything like that, but I think in general, the more you remove people from an effect of something, the more it will escalate. But I'm certainly not an expert on this, but I think that, you know, one thing you could look at with a lot of even the most basic technologies of cameras and recorders, that's also something that's removed and separated. And I think the word violence is funny because, you know, there's violence where people die, but there's also the violence of looking. You know, looking can also be violent and intrusive. But I don't know. I think it is kind of something, at least for me, that I haven't delved into. It's always been people manipulating a system at a closer range.
I mean, just what you're saying about the drones, I think that's an argument a lot of people make. Like Peter Singer has made that argument that these kind of automated and like removed forms of violence like really lower the threshold in terms of like entering into a conflict or perpetrating violence. But at the same time, if you look at like the invasion of Iraq or even the invasion of Afghanistan, which I don't support in any way, and you look at the level of violence in these wars compared to World War II, I mean, there's no comparison at all with World War II. Tens of millions of people like slaughtered indiscriminately, blowing up cities. I mean, that's part of the strategy. And that isn't really part of the strategy, like the American military strategy in Iraq. But there is, and maybe this is the link to violence or to surveillance, where it is much more of a kind of targeted forms of domination, right? Like really trying to figure out what are the buttons that you can push to try to control a situation and to just push those buttons. I'm writing a lot about orbits and satellites these days, and that's really a huge part of what goes on in space is how do you control a situation without anybody even realizing that you're doing it, you know?
This is kind of more for Jill, but this kind of makes me wonder about what the ideal subject would be for these observers, because a lot of these infrastructures were kind of set up to capture terrorists, I guess, and the terrorists are kind of the other, they're the unknown, they're like this very far removed thing. But what you did was to get very close to them and to put, to the observers, and to put, you know, a human face on it. So in an ideal world, I mean, if they have one, would everybody be doing what you're doing? Or, I don't know, what kind of response do they want from the people that they're watching or not watching?
You mean the Dutch Secret Service? Is that what you're asking?
I don't know. I was kind of thinking more about the Liverpool thing, but just any kind of
who are they watching?
Observer
are they
person.
Watching?
Are they watching? I mean, that at the time, it was really interesting to talk to those guys. The thing, I mean, there's so many theories around it, and I'm not going to posit one or say one is right, because it's not my interest. I'm more exploring what does exist, but there was one guy I met there who was a professor in that town, that city, and he felt that the surveillance system was set up to clean the city, that Liverpool had a really bad reputation from the riots that happened there, and that by putting up surveillance cameras was like the gargoyle thing, that it showed investors that, look, we're safe now. So that it served that purpose of making the city seem safe. So then it's all about perception of the vision of the cameras. And some of the guys working in it said to me there was definitely two camps of the police force. Half the camp really liked me and worked with me, and the other half did not like me and stayed away from me. But the guys that I did get to know, what I loved about talking to them was the ambivalence that they felt, as controllers. Like one guy said, you know, I used to be out on the street and I could smell if someone had alcohol in his breath, or, you know, there were all these other senses, and that was what I was trying to do in the letters. Like I was right then, and that's why I had to be so candid, because like I know this isn't the information you're looking for, but if you're going to watch, I'm going to tell you all the other things that you don't know. When I'm walking down the street, I'm thinking about this, I'm smelling this, I want this, I don't want that, like all those things, and you're going to have to read it all. And so it's a very particular view that these guys are getting that cuts off a lot of other things. And so I don't know what the ideal subject is, but I do think that unlike Trevor, his work is dealing with things that are much larger, but like most of these surveillance systems, like they're catching vandals, if that. They're not getting like the suited guy behind the wall making illegal tax, you know, evasions and things like that. And the other thing is it's retroactive. So they're never catching someone in the act. And that it changed my whole perception of memory, because one time, oddly, I was walking down the street and a guy tried to steal my bag. I was like, of all people, ideal subject, like, don't steal my bag. Like, I got a whole force behind me. So I had speed dial before I even reacted, and he didn't get it because it was like this. And I called up and I was like, I knew his name. I was like, Andy, camera 4, some guy just tried to steal my bag. And he goes, hold on, let me rewind you. And I love the language that comes out of these systems, you know. And the thing that was amazing is I got caught in that trap. Now I'm diverging. But anyways, I got caught in that trap because I didn't want to get anyone in trouble, and they pulled me down there. But the most amazing thing happened because I explained to them, I said, okay, I was walking this way, a guy on a bike came, he pulled, and they asked me to file this report, and I was writing all these things, and then they showed me the footage, and it was not, he like came from the other side, and this had just happened. And I was like, and then I felt crazy, you know what I mean? Because then I was like, I couldn't remember when I looked at the footage, and I got all entangled, and I couldn't, this idea of memory and how things are recorded, and then they told me their stories of I see something and I think it's one thing, but it's really something else. So the misinterpretation of the image, and also that I really didn't remember then. After that, like my own memory confused me. So I think these systems, they also create fiction. They're fiction machines. And that's also fascinating. But I don't know where truth lies in that situation.
And I wonder if they almost say something about some kind of diminution of civic life. I mean, Jane Jacobs, you know, right down the street, used to talk about eyes on the street. This wasn't in a negative sense. This was people looking out for each other. This cop knowing what was actually happening on the block. We've gone from eyes on the street to eyes in the sky. This kind of remote view where we've abdicated the kind of, I don't know. Does that? I don't know if that rings any truth with you, but
well, I think
kind of outsourced the.
Yeah. I think that they're just different levels of relationships, and that if you're distance, you're going to have more perspective. If you're close up, you're going to have your vision close up, and so all of those, and then you can be really 44 miles away, and this is your perception. And each one of those stages and levels have so many things to explore and think about how they affect perception on either end, like this entanglement of what you're saying, who you are to them and who they are to you. And yeah, I just think they're different levels and therefore different realities almost.
Like Powers of 10 or something.
Yeah.
Any other, I think maybe one last question and then we'll wrap it up.
This is a question of, sorry for my sorry for my English. This is a question about like your feeling after developing this project in Liverpool with the surveillance camera, and you was in the system dressed in red, and that remind me this virus I Love You. It was a famous virus, and but do you feel after all this project to have reinforced the system or to have opened something?
To reverse the
yes,
system?
Yes, to reinforce this system, or to have opened something on it.
Okay, you mean, did I change the system?
Yes, when you develop this type of project, you enter in the system, but it's a question about your personal feeling after developing this project. Do you feel that you reinforce this system, or you open something?
I think in terms of the system, the surveillance system, besides the people that I worked with and the people who see the piece, I don't think that I've changed the Liverpool surveillance system, and I don't consider myself an activist, so I wasn't trying to shut the system down. I do think in my small moment, of my own experience that I hope resonates, that the system became something else on top of what it already was, and I think that questions the system, and also shows the potential of the system to be used in another way. And it absolutely created, for me, an experience I've had never had before and never had since. It was being led blind through the city was one of the most intimate experiences I ever had. And after that piece, I went through, and all my pieces, unfortunately, I go through a hard time after, but I felt for a long time that I didn't exist because I was invisible again. It was like the weirdest way to walk around a city. So my experience of the city absolutely changed, and I know from talking to the cops that theirs did too. And all I can hope is that by making work and putting it out there, that people are affected in some way. So I would like to believe it opened up some other latent facet of a system that was already existing, and I think that's, for me right now, at least a kind of enough. But it's sort of unanswerable. I can only really answer it from my perspective.
Okay, we'll have to press stop there, and please give a hand for Jill and Trevor.
And to Tom.